But it's also interesting to notice who it is we assassinate. Do you ever notice who it is? Stop to think of who it is we kill. It's always people who've told us to live together in harmony and try to love one another. Jesus, Gandhi, Lincoln, John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, John Lennon. They all said, try to live together peacefully. Bam! Right in the fucking head. Apparently, we're not ready for that. Yeah, that's difficult behavior for us.
Hello, welcome to Crime Bytes, the show where we talk about some truly bizarre and disturbing crime cases. My name is Liz, and today is True Crime Tuesday. So, Lent is over, and so is our series on Lewis Lent. What did you guys think about that one? I enjoyed going more in depth and doing each separate story separately, kind of. Well, yeah, separately. And I've been wanting to cover Lewis Lent since I started this channel because of how close to home it is, and there really isn't a whole lot out there about him. Anyhow, today we're going to do something a little bit different for today's episode, but then we'll be back to our regular programming for the most part, whatever that is anyways. But for the next 2 months, it's going to be filicide. So there you go. Anyhow, I've always been a bit of a reader, and I'm trying to get more into it again. And I really did enjoy getting into Marjorie Metzger's Hidden Demons, and I stumbled upon my next read. I went to a church movie night a couple of weeks ago, and they were showing The Case for Christ. And it has Erica Christensen in it, so I was already there. I love her. But I enjoyed the movie as well. And more beyond that, I bought the book and I read it. And now I kind of want to talk about it, so I'm going to. I will say the movie and the book reference a couple of really wild true crime cases, and we are going to get into one of them. Although Jesus himself, I must say, even if you don't ascribe to him being God, at the very least, you could say, or most people could say, he was a man who was executed. And what was his crime? Now, innocent people being executed is something, I don't want to say I like to talk about it, but I am fascinated by it, and I always want to know more. And we will do a few more of those cases on this channel, but I kind of think this falls into that category. Was Jesus an innocent man who was executed? Was he guilty? Was he also a god or the god? Before we really get going here, I know Jesus isn't something that everyone wants to talk about or hear about. I have a very interesting true crime case as well that's going to be meshed in here. So I'm going to timestamp that right here. It does tie into the whole story though, without giving away too much though. It's about a police officer who gets shot, and there's a twist that no one saw coming. So if you want to see that, jump to this point in the video, because we're going to talk about Jesus first, and I do want to try and be sensitive to the fact that not everyone wants to do that. And I do my best to keep this channel as unbiased as I can. Having said that, The Case for Christ didn't really dive into the reason for Jesus's crucifixion too much, so we're going to try and dive into it just a little bit. Jesus was crucified or sent to death in Rome, allegedly for claiming to be the king of the Jews, which would have been considered a direct threat to Roman power. But the very man who ultimately sentenced him to die, Pontius Pilate, literally washed his hands of the whole situation. And many people speculate that he felt that Jesus was an innocent man, but still allowed him to be sentenced because everyone wanted him to die. Others will say it was to fulfill the prophecies, but for whatever underlying reason, he was ultimately sentenced. They would address the crowd and let them choose, essentially, if they should release Jesus, who What comes to my mind to describe him is when he says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone," when they are going to stone an adulteress. So a man who is known as a healer and for nonviolence, and maybe even a prophet or a peacemaker, they asked the crowd, should we let him go or should we let Barabbas, who was a convicted murderer, go? And the crowd would choose Barabbas. And with that, Pilate would wash his hands and Jesus was condemned. But he would say himself, "I find no fault with this man." Before Jesus was brought before Pilate after the infamous Last Supper, where he was betrayed by his disciple Judas, he was arrested and tried before the Sanhedrin, which was a Jewish judicial body, and he was found guilty by this system specifically of violating the Sabbath because he healed someone on that day. He was also found guilty of threatening to destroy the Jewish temple, sorcery, performing exorcisms by using demons, blasphemy, and claiming to be the Messiah. That's a lot. He was sent to be judged in Rome after this verdict for claiming to be the king of the Jews. They wanted blood. I would have to say this is an account of an innocent man being put to death, but I would be remiss to leave out the spiritual component. When I talk about that type of case, I am usually really mad and I want to explore the why. How could this have possibly happened? When in this case, the why is seemingly spelt out already if you are spiritually inclined to believe that way. It had to happen to fulfill the prophecies because, in fact, Jesus was the Messiah. Case closed. But it's not always that easy for everyone, myself included. And if you aren't inclined to believe that way, I guess the why is a lot harder to find. And that's how it was for Lee Strobel. So the case for Christ tells Lee Strobel's story. Lee was a legal editor working for the Chicago Tribune, and he considered himself to be an atheist. But then his wife told him that she had become a Christian. He recalls being disgusted and bracing for the worst, but then he was surprised by how his respect for her grew, and it prompted him to go into a full investigation on Christianity, news reporter style. He attempted to set aside his self-interest and prejudices the best he could, and anything he would have been trying to do to prove it wrong. And he couldn't. And like I said, I watched the movie and then bought and read the book, but what impressed me the most was how thoughtfully he did his research. He sought out, for the most part, people with doctorates in their fields from what I would consider to be prestigious universities. And at the end of every chapter, he leaves additional questions for you to ponder and additional sources to study. So let's get into it, and I'm going to get into some of the questions that Lee asked and the answers that he was given. So the first person Lee would talk to would be Dr. Bloomberg, who received his doctorate in New Testament from Aberdeen University in Scotland, and he would talk to him about the validity of the eyewitness evidence about Jesus. He and Dr. Bloomberg would sit down and go over 8 different tests, if you will, to attempt to determine if we can reasonably say that we can trust these eyewitnesses. They looked at the intention, ability, character, consistency, bias, probability of a cover-up, corroboration, and adverse witnesses. They came to the conclusion that these eyewitnesses would mostly be communicating verbally because writing was not as prolific as it is today. So verbal communication was different as well, and there was a higher importance placed on getting these historical stories accurate. There are minor inconsistencies that do corroborate the retelling, adding validity the same way it would be in court when two witnesses tell a story. There will and should be minor inconsistencies, but the core should remain the same. We can see this in a few places, and we'll get into at least one of them in a little bit. As far as biases, this can be argued two ways, that they were biased for Jesus, like pushing him, or they had so much respect for him that they had to make sure that the story was as accurate as possible because of that. And did they have anything to gain for being accurate? No, in most cases they were murdered for retelling the story. So being willing to lose your life indicates to me that you really believe what you are talking about. It doesn't seem that these witnesses were telling the story to cover anything up either, and the adverse witnesses did not deny the events. It seems they persecuted the followers but didn't deny what they were claiming, or that certain events had occurred anyways. It looks like we have a good starting point here, that the eyewitnesses truly believed in what they saw and reported it to the best of their ability. So Lee went on to tackle the next question. Can we trust these manuscripts? And for this question, he would go and interview Dr. Bruce Metzger, an 84-year-old who spent over 50 years teaching theology at Princeton, his alma mater. And he was going to answer the copies of copies question. With the New Testament, the original copy, if you will, is still not around, but there were a multitude of copies from that copy that did survive, allowing scholars to cross-reference them for accuracy, which was done. Early languages were Greek, Syriac, and Coptic, along with secondary translations in Armenian and Gothic. And looking at how information is consistent within these translations is an argument for their accuracy. In fact, we can't say this about any other manuscript. Homer's Iliad would be the second most distributed manuscript that we still have evidence of today, and there are only less than 650 left, many which are in fragments. To compare, there are over 5,000 cataloged New Testament manuscripts. Lee would ask Dr. Metzger another big question. It is well known that there are other Gospels, if you will, or works from that time, including the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of the Egyptians, and the Gospel of the Nativity of Mary, that were not included as what we know as the New Testament today. His explanation for this was that the church at the time had three criteria in deciding which manuscripts would be included. Apostolic authority, so they were either written by apostles themselves or by followers of these apostles. Mark was the helper of Peter, and Luke was an associate of Paul. He used an example of the road most traveled to highlight this point. These became more used, more distributed, and more accepted, so they became more prevalent. He also described the other Gospels as more banal. He did note that the Gospel of Thomas has been the one that historians go back and forth about as should it have been included, and he does not feel that it should have been, and actually spent some time researching and translating this gospel from Coptic. The gospel features 114 sayings of Jesus, but no narrative of what he did, and it's actually regarded as a little more questionably sexist than the others, so there's that. And I guess my point with mentioning that is that if the church was choosing what to put into the gospels to oppress women, which is an argument that's out there, they would probably have picked this one, and they didn't. He describes the canon, which is another name for the accepted four Gospels, as a list of authoritative books more than it is an authoritative list of books, meaning that these documents didn't derive their authority from being selected. They were authoritative and therefore were selected, which makes a lot of sense. He leaves Dr. Metzger with the following question. All these decades of scholarship, of study, of writing textbooks, of delving into the minutiae of the New Testament, what has all of this done for your personal faith? Oh, he said, it has increased the basis of my personal faith to see the firmness with which these materials have come down to us, with a multiplicity of copies, some of which are very, very ancient. So scholarship has not diluted your faith, he would be asked. On the contrary, it has built it. I've asked questions all my life, and I've dug into the text. I've studied this thoroughly, and today I know my trust in Jesus has been well placed. I really couldn't say it better. Anyways, the third person he would interview would be Dr. Edwin Yamuchi, a historian, and he wanted to talk to him about corroborating sources. Dr. Yamuchi would concur that the four Gospels are the most authoritative sources on Jesus' life, but there are other historical documents that corroborate them, and even in cases where sources are not testifying to Jesus being the Christ, they are acknowledging the immense magnitude that held so strongly to their beliefs that they were willing to die rather than recant. Specifically, James, the brother of Jesus, went from not thinking his brother was God to being willing to die for it. And this is recorded as well in Jewish sources. Sources also do not dispute that he was a healer, although while some called his works miracles, others called it sorcery. Another really interesting corroboration comes in the work of historian Thalius in 52 AD, who wrote about the darkness that is said to have occurred when Jesus was crucified in the Bible. Specifically, the phenomenon evidently was visible in Rome, Athens, and other Mediterranean cities. According to Tertullian, it was cosmic or a world event. Phlegon, a Greek author from Caria, writing it chronologically soon after 137 AD, reported that in the fourth year of the 202nd Olympiad, or 33 AD, there was a great eclipse of the sun, and it became night in the 6th hour of the day, or noon, so that the stars even appeared in the heavens. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia, and many things were overturned in Nicaea. I apologize with some of these pronunciations. I'm trying. But historians will say that it is not likely an eclipse happened here. It was just the easiest way to describe what was happening. But it lines up with the darkness described in the Bible. Dr. Yamuchi would conclude that even if you were to throw away every last copy of the Gospels, you would still have a picture of Jesus that's extremely compelling. In fact, it's a portrait of the unique Son of God, which, if you aren't going to take that part, at least it corroborates the portrait of Jesus that we can find in the Gospels. His fourth interview was with Dr. John McCrae, a professor of the New Testament and archaeology. He was very quick to state that archaeological studies enhance the credibility of the New Testament, meaning that historical sites described in the Bible were verified through their digs and other related studies. An example given was the pool of Bethsaida, which was described as having 5 porticios, but no such place had been found. Then recently, a pool was discovered and excavated that had 5 porticios, or whatever the heck. And that would obviously fill that hole, if you will. And he would go on to state that archaeology has not produced anything that is unequivocally a contradiction to the Bible. On the contrary, there have been things that have been codified into fact over the years, like that pool, that have been shown to be wrong. The more you know, which is really cool. And he would go on to interview Dr. Gregory Boy, a Princeton and Yale alumnus who debates atheists for fun. With facts, though. So he had a lot of interesting things to say, which basically boil down to, when a claim is made, how well does it hold up, and how much is just sensationalized? He went down a few different roads here. One in particular was called the Jesus Seminar, and I don't know a lot about this one. I didn't know anything about it before I read this book. And I still don't feel like I know much. But essentially, it seems like a group of people who are or were attempting to rebrand Jesus based on their own personal experiences, and essentially saying he didn't say maybe 80% of what he is credited with saying in the Gospels, which really gets Dr. Boyd going. And the first and most blatant argument would be basing their assumptions on what they've experienced about someone in a whole different time frame and culture. It seems wild to me, and I'm not sure that's a movement. And I guess that's not fair, because there are so many more much more wild movements out there. We've covered a couple of them, and we will cover some others. That's why a background on this stuff is important, though, to really look at what facts there are, documents that are still out there, and multiple sources from people who have studied this stuff, and then do more of your own research and make sure you are looking at your sources. The next question Lee attempted to tackle was Jesus really convinced that he was the Son of God? And I like this question. Some historians assert that the real Jesus would be rolling in his grave if he knew people were worshiping him the way that we do today. Which, given Jesus's character, if you don't believe he is God, yeah, this is definitely a logical assertion. But for this question, Lee would interview Dr. Ben Witherington, a Duke University and Gordon Conwell educated author who wrote about the life of Jesus. Dr. Witherington would insert that Jesus absolutely knew he was God, but chose not to go around saying so. Instead, he chose to remain humble and really careful, because saying he was God would be seen as clear-cut blasphemy, and ultimately what ended up happening. And he goes on to point out that Jesus telling the religious leaders that it is not what enters a person that defiles him, but what comes out of his heart, which, but the point is that at the time it set aside huge portions of Leviticus, which talks all about meats and defiled meats, and really kind of scared me when I was a child attempting to try and read through the whole Bible. But anyhow, the priests at the time were obviously not okay with this. Like, who does he think he is, that he has the authority to set aside basically the Jewish scriptures? And Jesus did speak as if he had authority over these scriptures. So what does that say about what he thought about himself? Clearly he assumed that he had that authority, or some level of authority, which will lead us straight to the next question. Was Jesus crazy when he claimed to be the Son of God? For this question, Lee would go and interview Gary Collins, who studied at Purdue for his doctorate in clinical psychology. The short answer would be that yes, We see people with psychological difficulties claiming to be somebody or something they're not all the time, every day. In fact, many of his Jewish peers thought that he was demon-possessed and a raving lunatic, but at the same time, Jesus didn't just claim to be the Son of God. He backed it up with healings and miracles, and other arguments suggest that he may have been a hypnotist or even an exorcist, which brings the question of demons back up. And Dr. Collin quotes C.S. Lewis for this one, and it's a good one that I would have to agree with. There are two errors concerning demons. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased with both errors. Interestingly, he also notes the practice of psychology, and 25 years or so ago, the suggestion of demonic activity would have been immediately dismissed, but now more and more psychologists are beginning to recognize that maybe there are more things in heaven and earth that our philosophies can account for. And I think a lot of us can at least agree in some supernatural forces that exist. Maybe not what they are and how they operate, but I think there are just some things that cannot be logically explained easily anyways. And demons certainly are one way to explain them. But let's get back to Jesus. Collins was also quick to point out that Jesus's profound wisdom, uncanny insights, eloquence, and clear compassion were not indicative of mental issues, which leads us to the next question. Did Jesus fulfill the attributes of God? I love Lee's example here because he uses a kidnapping case and a sketch artist to illustrate it. Sure, Jesus claimed to be God, but does he fit the description? To help answer this question, he would interview Dr. Donald Carson, who studied at Cambridge. This one became tricky because of the omnis. Was he in fact omniscient or omnipotent and omnipresent? How could he be everywhere and where he actually was, if that even makes sense? Or was he a lesser God? He's commonly known as the Son of God, and John 14:28 says that the Father is greater than I, and it's come to be accepted that he is suggesting that he is more limited by his incarnation. In a sense, it's not denying his deity, it's saying that he is limited by his human form or incarnation. Does that make sense? Because it took me a minute, but I think I get it. I think I get what they're trying to say there. The next part I know a lot of people struggle with, including myself. How is a God loving when he sends people to hell, or so many people suffer here on earth? And Carson's short answer is that justice is not always done in this world. We see that every day, but at the last day it will be done for all to see, and no one will be able to complain by saying it isn't fair, which is a comforting thought, especially in the true crime community, to think that in the end justice will be done and no one really gets away with anything. I like that, but like I said, I personally do struggle with this concept as well. So I suppose it's part of why I like to dive into depravities that occur in this world and ask why people act the way that they do. Anyhow, at this point, Lee is ready to tackle the fingerprint question. Essentially, throughout the Old Testament, there were prophecies about who the Messiah would be. Many, many prophecies. So many that it would be almost impossible, scratch that, it would be impossible for someone to fulfill all of them. And that was the point. When someone did, it would show that they, and they alone, were the Messiah. Like a fingerprint, there are no identical fingerprints. So for this one, Lee interviews Louis Lapides, a Jewish Bible professor who specializes in this topic. He would recall his own story of being raised in a Jewish house with the Old Testament, basically to regard the New Testament as irrelevant and potentially even dangerous to his beliefs. He ended up being drafted and seeing a lot in the war and turning to Buddhism and being on track to becoming a Buddhist monk when he decided to get into it with a street preacher who inspired him to look at the Old and New Testament, to which he agreed to study the Old Testament but wouldn't touch the New Testament. Until he got to this passage in Isaiah that I want to read for you because to me this is really cool. It's Isaiah 53, 3 through 9, and then verse 12. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hid their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, and the punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. Though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So instantly when Lapides read this, he thought of Jesus, and his first thought was, this must be a fraud. And he asked his mother to send him a Jewish Bible. And I love that so much because guess what? It was written there too. And yes, it seems like it is talking about Jesus, but was written by Isaiah long before he ever existed. These are the things you can't really explain. After finding many more prophecies, over 4 dozen that Jesus fulfilled, he decided to break open the New Testament. And when he did, he describes it as feeling so nervous, like he was going to be hit by a lightning bolt. And then he opens it and it's just Jesus's genealogy. But even that was revolutionary because he didn't realize, I guess, how Jewish Jesus was. Essentially, he grew up thinking Jesus was a God for the Gentiles or non-Jews, and he's reading Son of Abraham, Son of David. Looking at all of this, he describes it as seeing it very clearly as someone who believed in the embodiment of evil. You're either on God's side or Satan's side. And he chose God's side, so they got into what Lee had come for. What are the odds that Jesus could have fulfilled all these prophecies? Someone figured out the probability of just 8 of the dozens of prophecies would be 1 in 100 million billion, which I don't even know how many zeros that is, but the odds are beyond low. Way beyond low. He used the example I've heard before, but I really like it. If you cover the state of Texas with silver dollars with a depth of 2 feet, then mark X on one of them and have a blindfolded person wander around the state, bend down and pick one, those are the odds that he would pick the marked coin. Some odds, and that's just for 8 of them. I'm doing probability and math with my son right now, and even P8 and P12 for say 1 more dozen prophecies would be more than 100 million billion times 100 million billion. Do that a few more times for each dozen, and well, it's bordering on impossible. And yet This man spends a lot of his time reading works from people trying to debunk these things and claims that every time the prophecies have stood up and shown themselves to be true. He also challenges everyone not to take his word for it and to go and do your own research, which I just love, and that's part of my heart with presenting all of this, to encourage you to look deeper if you're inclined to do so. Don't take everything at face value. Don't take anything I'm saying at face value. With this and any other case, really, if something seems off, look into it, because knowledge is power. He also brings up Stan Telkin, who is a famous businessman who is also Jewish and went on his own quest to expose the cult of Christianity, and likely Strobel and Louis Lapidus did. He ended up becoming a believer as well and wrote a book called Betrayed. And I'm pretty sure that's where the Texas coin analogy comes from, but I'm not positive. I could be wrong. I do love stories like this, though, and there are other stories as well of rabbis setting out to prove that Jesus was not the Messiah, only to come to believe that he is. Now let's get into some of the medical evidence presented. To examine the medical evidence surrounding Jesus' resurrection, Lee would have a chat with Dr. Robert Stein, a forensic pathologist, a world-renowned forensic pathologist who even helped to convict John Wayne Gacy. He helped to decide things like if a child died from falling or being bludgeoned. And a common question surrounding Jesus' death was it a resurrection or a resuscitation, or did he even die on the cross at all? He would also talk to Dr. Metherell, a medical doctor, about the actual crucifixion process, which was extremely brutal. Typical Roman floggings were at least 39 lashes, but often more, with whips of braided leather with metal and bone woven in to create maximum damage. That there is enough for me. And victims of these floggings would be left so ravaged that at times part of their spines would be exposed. So obviously some would not even make it to their actual crucifixion, and the doctor describes a condition called hypovolemic shock, which is what the Bible suggests Jesus fell into after he was flogged. Basically, the body is suffering the effects of large amounts of blood loss, and after this, a doctor would say that Jesus was in serious, even critical condition before he had the spikes even driven into his wrists and his feet. Obviously, with all of this torture, victims of full-on Roman crucifixion could die in a variety of ways, but if you didn't die before you were hung on the cross, you would end up suffocating, because after a time you would be too exhausted to pull yourself upward and able to breathe, which would obviously be slow and excruciating. And fun fact, I can't help calling things that, but a very interesting fact at least, the word excruciating was actually created to describe a level of pain indescribable like that of a crucifixion, translating to out of the cross, excruciating. So back to, did Jesus really die? Jesus is going into hypovolemic shock, and that would have given him a much higher heart rate throughout his crucifixion, leading to heart failure, which in this circumstance would result in a collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart and around the lungs, which can be seen when the Roman soldier plunges his spear into Jesus and describes blood and water as flowing out. This would also be a clear indication of death. This both confirmed his death, but also spared him from having his legs broken, like the two men being crucified alongside of him, which essentially was done to speed up the asphyxiation process if the crucifixion was taking too long. But they didn't do that to Jesus because he was already dead. And this fulfilled another Old Testament prophecy that stated that his bones would remain unbroken. So Lee would go on and look at the burial, and for this part he would interview Dr. William Craig to ask if Jesus was actually buried in the tomb. First, this was not a common practice, which, okay, they specifically state that Joseph of Arimathea asked to give him a burial. So if we go with that, there's the question of him being a member of the group of people who voted to have Jesus executed. And the Gospel of Luke explains this unanimous vote by him not being present when it was taken, which is possible, and it is significant because it is unlikely that they would have made up such a character, which seems fair to me. Then they start getting into inconsistencies between the Gospels as to the state of the tomb when they discovered it. Ooh. Shh. When they discovered Jesus wasn't there anymore. Mostly, was the stone rolled away before they walked up? Who was there? Where was the angel? And things like this, which is fair, but what does not change is, again, the core of the story, which actually enhances its validity. Maybe these details can be questioned further, but the core of the story, Jesus being put in a tomb, and then the tomb was visited by a small group of people who found it empty, and the angels tell them that he has risen, remains consistent. Lee goes further to break it down in terms that I, and probably you if you're into true crime, can appreciate. When you look at a witness testimony or the testimony of an event from multiple witnesses, you would expect there to be minor discrepancies, and if there aren't any, you're going to wonder if they memorized the same thing or one copied off the other, because people see things differently and pick up on different details. Yet we look for the core of the main event. Do those details stay the same? Another historical example was that of Hannibal crossing the Alps to attack Rome. Apparently there are two narratives of this event that are completely incompatible and irreconcilable, but they both describe this one event, Hannibal crossing the Alps to attack Rome, which historians all agree happened. And that piece remains consistent, so it's not up for debate. What would be up for debate would be which account is accurate. So it would be with the account of the empty tomb. That part remains consistent. Which account of that account is accurate? He would go on to state that it was highly unlikely that the disciples or the Jewish authorities would move the body. The disciples went on to, in many cases, be killed themselves for their beliefs, which most people wouldn't do if they knew it wasn't true or they moved the body and didn't really believe in what they were dying for. Yes, we want to explain it because it sounds crazy, but Dr. Craig says it best when he says, I think people who push these alternative theories would admit, yes, our theories are implausible, but they're not as improbable as the idea that this spectacular miracle occurred, which is also fair, but based on all the evidence, that is the most likely answer, and if it's possible that God exists, it's certainly possible that he chose to do this. I think that's what a lot of people, including myself, tend to struggle with, that if this is all real, what does that mean for me? For my life, for my worldview, everything like that. That's a huge question, and potentially a life-changing question. The next question asked was Jesus seen alive after the cross? And to investigate this one, Lee would talk to Oxford-educated Dr. Gary Habermas, who actually would write his dissertation on the resurrection. He basically said that proving the resurrection was simple. First, did Jesus die on the cross? And I think we can conclude that yes, he did. Then, if that was the case, did people see him after that? To do this, you have to examine the evidence that we do have. Paul discusses the people that saw Jesus in 1 Corinthians, which were apparently words delivered to him that were passed along by holy tradition as they were back in that day. He was referenced in the Gospels as appearing to numerous people, but another key thing that is undeniable is this resurrection is what started the Christian faith. They didn't just endorse Jesus' teaching, they were convinced themselves that they had seen him alive after he had been crucified, so convinced that they were dying for it. Was there any other circumstantial evidence that would help out this case, though? And Lee's last interview would be with Dr. J.P. Moreland, who was a philosopher from Southern California. What other things can we use to corroborate this resurrection? And his first point was that the disciples were dying for their beliefs, that they had experienced and seen these things with their own eyes. So that's serious conviction. And it's different from a Christian dying for their faith today because they literally had seen Jesus after he was resurrected. They experienced firsthand what they were dying for. And yeah, they thought it was real. His next point was the conversion of many skeptics, specifically Paul. And he would then go on to talk about the changes to key social structures at that time after all of this happened, specifically to the Jewish faith, which again argues the significance of the events. He would describe his history starting as a skeptic as well and then examining the evidence. Seems like I'm saying this over and over. There's quite a few of them here. He would say, in 3 decades, I've had hundreds of specific answers to prayers. I've had things happen that simply cannot be explained by natural explanations, and I have experienced a changed life beyond anything I could have imagined, which is something I've heard countless people say, and I would say for myself as well. He goes on to advise not to trust your own experience, but to use your mind calmly and weigh the evidence, and then let your experience be a confirming piece of evidence, or not. Second, if that evidence points to it's true, is that just your final confirmation? I don't know, it's different for everyone. After spending all this time meeting with some of the brightest minds in investigating the topic, Lee Strobel concluded it would take more faith for him to remain an atheist than to believe in Jesus, and I personally agree, but what do you think? I know this one can get really touchy, so whatever you do choose to believe, if you do want to comment, I just would ask that you be respectful. I know I'm opening myself up majorly here, all this exposure therapy. But yeah, respect goes a long way. I tried to do it as respectfully as I could as well. Anyhow, the case that Lee really used to drive the case for Christ home for him was that of James Dixon, and we're going to run down that case now because it is a really good one. The first significant event in this case would occur on April 24th of 1971 when Ronald Thompson would get shot. His 15-year-old brother Mitchell would report seeing 18-year-old James Dixon and another boy in the street when it happened. They were briefly talking to his brother, and then he saw Dixon pull a gun from under his jacket, but when he ran down the stairs to warn his brother, a shot had already rang out and Dixon and the other boy had started running away already. He would identify James Dixon as the one with the gun, and he would be charged with murder. He would be tried at a bench trial and be convicted and sentenced to 25 to 60 years in prison. There was a second witness whose statement was suppressed, and it did not include seeing a car pull up as Mitchell Thompson had stated, and this witness had saw a group of boys traveling on foot by the corner where the shooting took place. He heard a shot and saw the boys flee. This was enough to get a mistrial, and on April 24th of 1974, the conviction was reversed and he was granted a new trial, but shortly after that, the charges were completely dismissed when Mitchell Thompson would recant his statement. Then, a year after he was released, he would be charged with shooting Chicago Police Sergeant Richard Scanlon. So let's look at the initial facts about this part of the case. A neighbor called the police to report a man with a gun. Officer Scanlon arrived to find James Dixon loudly arguing with his girlfriend's father, and as he approached, the men began to fight physically. Scanlon ran in to break up the fight, and a shot rang out, hitting and wounding Scanlon. They would find a .22 caliber gun belonging to Dixon and covered in his fingerprints with one bullet missing. Sergeant Scanlon's gun remained in its holster, and the father Dixon was fighting didn't have a gun. Scanlon's sin showed that he had been shot from a close range. Now, add to that Dixon's history. On top of this, when Dixon came in, he would plead guilty. So, case closed, right? It seems completely airtight in my head, especially with the guilty plea. As he pled guilty, Lee Strobel was at the trial taking notes, and Sergeant Scanlon would go on to receive a Medal of Bravery for his efforts. But then a tip would come in from an informant that Lee had gotten to know while working in the criminal courts building. The word on the street was that Sergeant Scanlon was at a party showing off his new pen gun. Pen guns are illegal for anyone to carry, including cops. So when his illegal pen gun went off and he was shot and Dixon was brought in, he let him take the fall for it. Lee would look further into what was going on, and some other key pieces of information would support the pen gun discharge theory. Witnesses would claim that Dixon's gun had discharged before Scanlon had even arrived, and Dixon's gun had only discharged once. The witnesses would say that it went downward into the front porch, and there was a chip in the porch that was consistent with that testimony. So that creates some doubt in the story now. Dixon also claimed he had hidden the gun because he didn't want to be caught with it, not because he had shot the officer. The powder burns that they looked at on Sergeant Scanlon to determine that he had been shot at a close range, more importantly, they were concentrated inside but not above his left pocket. And yes, Dixon pled guilty, but as part of a plea bargain, he pled guilty to receive a year in prison when he was facing 20 years. That's pretty reasonable, especially looking at how the evidence wasn't so much looking in his favor at a first glance. But when you look at these further details, something seemed off, and once the pen gun was introduced, it all made sense in the end. Sergeant Scanlon was stripped of his medal and indicted by a grand jury, pled guilty to official misconduct, and was fired from the department. Lee's stories were becoming front pagers, but what he notes he learned most from this case, literally helping to break this case, was that evidence can be aligned to point in more than one direction. And Dixon would go on to receive something from the city and be exonerated. There's a really cool part in the movie where he's talking to Strobel, and I'll see if I can clip it in here. But if I can't, he's saying, like, why didn't you just tell me? And Dixon is just like, you didn't want to see it. And he equates that to his experience with Jesus as well. And it's really powerful. If I can't find it or clip it in or copyright violations, I encourage you to see the movie. Unless you're totally against it. It's a great movie. So I did as well. I started looking into rebuttals while I was writing this. And there is a case against the case for Christ. And I think there's even a case against the case for Christ. Which I should know was written by another... The case against the case for Christ was written by another Gordon Cornell alumni. Also a member of that Jesus Project that we mentioned. I saw mixed reviews about that one, and I would be a bit reluctant based on the Jesus Project affiliation, which was my bad. I thought it was the same. The Jesus Seminar is the one we mentioned. The Jesus Project is a project out to prove that Jesus didn't exist at all, even as a historical figure. And I put on a YouTube of the author talking about his book for about 10 minutes or so, and to me it was off-putting. That's all I feel like I can say, though, without researching it further. As always, do your own research. I would be remiss not to mention it, though. The resounding negative review that I did find for the case for Christ is that Strobel didn't prove the case for Christ, which I would say is probably impossible to do, but having as many facts as you can lined up like he did certainly helps. And the fact that Strobel started writing this as a believer and not an atheist, which he did, but he poses his questions as the person who doesn't believe, or at least that was my take. Yes, he looked out affirmative sources, but he questioned them all. And he was looking to find sources that pointed to Jesus' existence and resurrection, and he did start the journey as an atheist. He just went in to go deeper later and write the book as a believer. Tomato, tomato. But as always, he presents what he finds and says, do your own research, and gives more sources. So do your own research. All right, so I've got Scoot over here. And that's going to be today's real fact with Scoot Dog. If you are unsure, or even if you think you're sure, do your own research. I really like this book because I feel like he did a lot of research and it's full of sources to expand on that, which I haven't done yet, but I might choose to do in the future. I found the book compelling though. But each topic does have further areas that you can explore if there's a specific topic you want to know more about. And I don't know how to end this one. Today's positive note is going to be the positive impact this made in Lee Strobel's life. He describes, after this happened, his daughter, who was 5, telling his wife, "Mommy, I want God to do for me what he's done for Daddy." True followers of Jesus are good people, and that's where you look at what people do and not what they say. That for me, I've been hurt the most in my life by people who have said they love Jesus, unfortunately. But what people do and what they say can be very different, and we need to look at what they do. Sticking feathers up your ass does not make you a chicken or a bull terrier. I had to say that one. It's one of my all-time favorites. All right, guys. Next week, we're going to look at a bad romance, I think, probably, and then we'll get into May. It looks like we've got 5 weeks in May this year, so I'm going to have to find us 5 mothers who have murdered. I don't think I have anyone in mind yet either, so if you have any suggestions, feel free to drop them here. And until next week, please stay safe out there. Bye.